Days after my daughter was born, my husband packed 2 suitcases and told me his mother needed her house quiet again, so I should stay at my parents' place until things settled. He left a note on the kitchen counter, weighted down by a coffee mug, and the note said the baby and I would be more comfortable somewhere with help. I read it 3 times. The mug had a chip in the handle. I remember staring at that chip longer than I stared at the words, because the words I already understood, and the chip was something I could still do something about. I didn't cry. People always expect that part. They lean in when I tell this story, waiting for the breakdown, the wailing, the floor. But I was 40 hours out from a C-section, my milk had just come in, and there was a 7-pound person in a bassinet who needed me to keep functioning. Grief is a luxury you take out on credit when someone else can cover the shift. Nobody could cover my shift. So I folded the note in half, put it in the drawer with the takeout menus, and I started thinking. His name was Trevor. We'd been married 2 years and together for 5 before that. I met him when I was 26, waiting tables at a steakhouse off the interstate while I finished my associates in accounting, and he came in with a group of men in good suits and tipped me $100 on a $40 tab. I thought it was generous. I learned later it was advertising. Trevor spent money the way some people pray, loudly and in public, hoping to be seen doing it. His family had real money. Not show money, real money, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't have to. His father, my father-in-law, had built a regional chain of orthopedic clinics across 3 states and then sold most of it and kept the buildings, so the man owned commercial real estate the way other people own paperbacks. He scared me a little the first time I met him. He had this way of looking at you like he was reading the fine print of a contract he hadn't decided to sign. Cold eyes, flat mouth. He shook my hand once, looked at Trevor, and said, "She's sharper than the last one," and walked into another room. I should have understood, that day, that I was being assessed. I thought he was being rude. He was being accurate. Trevor's mother was the opposite, all warmth on the surface and ice underneath. She called me honey in a tone that made it sound like a diagnosis. She redecorated our guest room without asking. She showed up with casseroles and opinions, and when I got pregnant, she got worse, because now there was a grandchild in the equation and she wanted to make sure the grandchild understood early who held the strings, the house, the trust, the name. She talked about the name like it was a kingdom, and my daughter was a possible heir who hadn't passed her audition yet. So, when Trevor left me at my parents' 3-bedroom ranch in a tired suburb 40 minutes outside the city, with a note and a chipped mug and a newborn, I want you to understand it wasn't a surprise. It was a clarification. My parents were good people, are good people. My dad fixed HVAC systems for 31 years and my mom did the books for a dental office. And they raised me to believe that you don't ask for help you haven't earned and you don't take charity dressed up as love. When Trevor's note made it clear which one I'd been receiving, my mom sat at the foot of the pull-out bed they'd set up for me and held my daughter and said, "What do you want to do, baby? Not what should you do, what should you do, not what should you bomb. What you want?" My mother always understood that those were 3 different questions. I told her I wanted to wait. She didn't understand at first. She thought I meant wait for him to come back. I didn't. Here's the thing, nobody tells you about being underestimated. It's the closest thing to a superpower a regular person ever gets. Trevor thought I come from nothing, which to him meant I was nothing, which meant I'd take whatever scraps the family decided to throw, sign whatever paper got slid across the table, and be grateful. His mother thought the same, and I let them think it. Because the moment you correct someone's low opinion of you, you give up the only real advantage you have. I started with the documents. I'd been the one handling our household finances the whole marriage, because Trevor found it boring and I found it interesting. And that small division of labor turned out to be the hinge the whole thing swung on. I knew our accounts. I knew the joint card, the one his mother paid off every month. I knew because I'd seen the statements that the house we'd lived in wasn't ours. It was held by one of his father's LLCs, and we were essentially tenants who happened to be related to the landlord. And I knew that nothing had Trevor's name on it in a way that mattered. Not the house, not the cars, not the membership at the club. He was a man who lived like a prince in a castle that belonged entirely to his father. That fact changed everything about how I understood the family. Trevor wasn't powerful. He was an appendage. The power was the old man's. And the old man, I was starting to realize, didn't think much of his son. So I did something that probably sounds insane. About 6 weeks after Trevor left, when I could sit up without wincing and my daughter had figured out the difference between day and night, I wrote the old man a letter. Not Trevor. Not the mother. Him. I wrote it by hand, 3 drafts, and I didn't beg and I didn't accuse. I told him he had a granddaughter named Eleanor. I told him she had his eyes, which was true, that flat assessing gray. I told him I wasn't writing to ask for anything, that my parents and I had it handled, but that I thought a man who'd built what he built might want to know his bloodline continued, and that the door was open if he ever wanted to walk through it. I included one photograph. I mailed it to his office, not the house, because I'd learned the mother screened the house mail. 2 weeks of silence. Then a card, in handwriting like an architect's, that said only, Thursday, 2 o'clock. The Whitman Building, 11th floor. Come alone. I came alone. I left Eleanor with my mom and I drove 40 minutes into the city in my parents' 8-year-old Camry, and I parked in a garage that cost $11 an hour, and I went up to the 11th floor of a building with his name etched in the lobby stone. And a woman with a headset showed me into an office that smelled like old paper and the inside of a leather glove. He was standing at the window. He didn't turn around for a long moment, and when he did, he looked at me the way he had at our first meeting, reading the fine print. You didn't ask for money, he said. Not hello. Why not? Because if I'd asked, you'd have given me just enough to make me go away, I said. And I'm not going away? The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't a smile. It was the place where a smile would go if he'd ever learned how. Sit down, he said. We talked for 2 hours. He asked about Eleanor. He asked about my background, my schooling, my plans, and I answered everything plainly because I'd already decided that with this man, the truth was the only currency he respected. At one point he asked what I thought of his son, and I considered lying, and then I didn't. I said, I think he raised a man who never had to be hungry for anything, and so he never learned how to want something enough to keep it. The old man was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, including you. And it wasn't a question, and I didn't answer because we both already knew. Before I left, he asked if I had work. I told him I had my accounting credential and I'd been doing the books for my dad's old company part-time, remote, since the baby. He nodded slowly. He said his foundation, the charitable arm that handled the buildings he kept and the scholarships he funded, was a mess, run by a board of golf buddies who couldn't read a balance sheet. He said it almost idly. He said maybe I'd take a look at the books sometime as a favor, paid of course, nothing formal. I said I would. That was the beginning. Not of revenge. I want to be careful with that word, because the comments I imagine, the people who hear this and decide I'm a calculating woman, a gold digger with a longer game, they reach for revenge because it's tidy. But it wasn't that. It was that a powerful man and an underestimated woman recognize something in each other across a generation and a fortune, which is that we were both people who finished what we started. And neither of us had ever been able to say so out loud to family who didn't understand it. I did the foundation's books. I found $400,000 in vendor contracts going to a board member's brother-in-law. I documented it cleanly, no drama, just spreadsheets, and I brought it to the old man in a folder and slid it across his desk the way I'd once imagined the divorce papers being slid across to me. He looked at it, he looked at me. He said, "How long did this take you?" I said, 6 evenings. He fired 3 board members the following month and asked me to take a formal seat. Salaried, with a title, with a key card and a parking spot that didn't cost $11 an hour. I rented a small house 10 minutes from my parents so my mom could still see Eleanor every day. I bought a used Honda that wasn't a Camry. I started paying my parents back for the months I'd lived with them, and when my dad refused the money, I put it in an account for Eleanor instead, and told him that was the only way I'd accept the kindness, by passing it down. He understood that. We come from the same place. The old man and I didn't become friends exactly. We became something I don't have a clean word for. He'd call on Sunday evenings to ask about a line item or a granddaughter, and the two subjects blurred until I couldn't always tell which one a given call was really about. He came to Eleanor's first birthday and sat in my parents' tiny backyard in a $1,000 coat and ate grocery store sheet cake off a paper plate and watched my daughter smash frosting into her own face. And at one point, I caught him not watching her but watching me watch her. And he said quietly, he doesn't know what he gave up. I said, no. He said, neither do I, until lately. For 3 years, I built a life, a real one, mine, on a foundation no one could repossess because I'd poured it myself. I had work I was good at. I had a daughter who was funny and stubborn and looked more like her grandfather every year. I had savings I'd earned, and a community at the foundation and a standing Tuesday dinner at my parents' house. I was not waiting for anyone. That's the part I most want people to hear. By the end of those 3 years, I had genuinely stopped waiting because I'd stopped needing the thing I'd once half expected to come back. And then it came back anyway. Trevor showed up on a Saturday in October. He didn't call. He just appeared at my little rented house, and he looked good, tan, rested, the way men look when they've spent a few years not carrying anything heavier than their own opinion of themselves. He'd been in Colorado, it turned out, then Arizona, doing the things men do when their family money lets them mistake a long vacation for finding themselves. He stood on my porch with a bouquet from a gas station. You could still see the price sticker, and he smiled at me like no time had passed at all. Hey, he said. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I had Eleanor on my hip. She looked at him with my father-in-law's flat gray eyes and asked me in the loud, clear voice of a 3-year-old, "Who's that?" And I watched something move across Trevor's face, some calculation, because, of course, he'd known he had a daughter. The mother would have told him, but knowing it and standing in front of it are different sizes of fact. He'd come back, he explained, sitting at my kitchen table that he assumed he was welcome at, because he was ready now, ready to be a family. He had a plan. We'd all move back to the city, into one of his father's houses, and he'd step into his role at the foundation, the role he was owed. And Eleanor would grow up with everything, and didn't they want that for her? Everything? I let him talk. I'd learned that from the old man, how much a person tells you when you simply let them keep going. And Trevor told me everything. He told me he'd had a falling out with his father years ago, before he even left me, that the foundation seat had been promised and then withheld, that he'd left partly to punish the old man, and that he'd come back now because he'd heard, through his mother, that things at the foundation had changed, that there was new blood, fresh leadership. And he figured the easiest path back into his father's good graces and his father's money was through the wife and the kid he'd left on a counter with a chipped mug. He didn't know. That's the part that still amazes me. He didn't know who the new leadership was. His mother, screening his calls the way she'd screened the old man's mail, had managed to mention everything except the name. He thought he was coming back to slide into a seat. He didn't realize the seat was mine. I made him coffee. I gave him the mug with the chip, the one I'd kept all those years for reasons I couldn't have explained until that exact moment. And I told him, calmly, the way I'd told his father the truth 3 years before, that I'd been running the foundation for 2 years, that I'd uncovered the fraud his golf buddy board had been running, that his father trusted me with the trusts and the voting shares and the succession, and that the role he thought he was owed had already been filled, by me, and filled well. He didn't believe me at first. Then he called his father, right there at my table, on speaker, to clear up what he assumed was my confusion. And the old man's voice came through the little phone, dry as a bone, and said, "Everything she told you is true. She's the best decision I've made in 20 years. You're the worst." And then he hung up. I have watched a lot of people receive bad news in my line of work. I've sat across desks while people learned they'd been embezzled from, lied to, written out of wills. I have never seen anyone come apart the way Trevor did at my kitchen table. The tan didn't help him. The good rest didn't help him. He had built his entire understanding of his own future on the assumption that the people he'd discarded would simply still be there, in the same condition he'd left them, waiting to be picked back up. And the floor of that assumption gave way all at once. He raised his voice. Eleanor started to cry, and I took her to her room and shut the door, and when I came back, he'd stopped shouting and was just sitting there, holding the chipped mug, and he asked me, in a small voice I almost felt something for, what he was supposed to do now. And I realized he was asking me to manage his life again, the way I'd managed it for the whole marriage without either of us naming it. He wanted me to tell him the plan. He'd always wanted someone to tell him the plan. He'd always wanted someone to tell him the plan. I don't know, I said. That's not my job anymore. I asked him to leave. He did. He left the flowers on the table, and the price sticker was still on them, and I threw them in the trash after I heard his car pull out. And then I went and got my daughter, and we made macaroni and cheese from the box, because that's what she wanted. And we ate it on the floor of the living room watching cartoons, and I was fine. That's the strangest part of the whole story. I kept waiting that night for the grief I'd put on credit 3 years before to finally come due. It never did. There was nothing to grieve. I'd already buried the marriage the morning I read the note, and what came back to my porch in October wasn't my husband. It was just a man who'd been wrong about me for a very long time and had finally found out. The divorce, when it went through, was quiet. His own father's lawyers handled my side, which is a sentence I still can't quite believe I get to say. There was no fight over Eleanor. Trevor didn't really want custody, he wanted access to a future, and once that future closed, he lost interest in the parts of it that involved diapers and parent-teacher conferences. He sees her twice a year, awkwardly, at the old man's insistence, and she calls him by his first name because that's what he is to her, a man named Trevor who visits. The old man passed 2 winters ago. He left the foundation in my hands, formally. In a will, so airtight his own lawyers said they'd never seen the mother get cut out so cleanly. He left a trust for Eleanor that will let her choose any life she wants without ever once having to take charity dressed up as love. And he left me a letter, handwritten in that architect's script, that I keep in the same drawer where I once put a note folded in half under the takeout menus. I won't tell you everything it said, but the last line was, "You were never the one who needed taking care of." I think about that more than I should. People hear this and they want to make me into something. A schemer. A gold digger who simply played the longer game. A cold woman. I've made my peace with that, because I understand where it comes from. If a man had done what I did, married into a family, gotten written off, and then quietly outworked and outthought everyone until he held the keys, we'd call it a comeback. We'd make a movie about him. He'd be a hero in a good suit. When a woman does it, people reach for uglier words, and the ugliest part is that I think the words are aimed at the calm. People can forgive a woman for falling apart. What they can't forgive is a woman who reads the note, folds it in half, and gets to work. So here's what I tell anyone standing in a kitchen right now with a chipped mug and a note they've read 3 times. You don't have to scream. You don't have to fall. You don't have to be the wreck the people who underestimated you expect. The wreck that would prove them right. You can just get quiet and get clear and start finding out exactly what you're made of. Because the people who leave you on a counter and walk out the door, they've already told you the most important thing about themselves, that they thought you were nothing. Let them keep thinking it. It's the last advantage they'll ever give you. The chipped mug sat in my cupboard for 3 years before it meant anything, and I think about that a lot now. I kept it without knowing why, and then one October morning it became the exact thing I needed to hand a man who'd forgotten what he threw away. Nothing in my story happened by luck. Trevor left because he'd never once in his life had to fight to keep something, and a man who has never been hungry will always assume the meal will still be warm whenever he decides to come back. He was wrong because of who he was, not because of bad timing. That's the first thing I had to make peace with. What saved me wasn't anger. Anger is loud and it burns out fast. And the morning I read that note, I had a daughter who needed me functional, not furious. So I chose to stay decent. I never lied to his father, never schemed in the dark, never poisoned Eleanor against anyone. I just told the truth and did clean work and let the results speak. And it turned out that honesty, the boring, unglamorous kind, was the one currency the old man actually respected. People want to call me cold and calculating, but the truth is I won by being the most straightforward person in every room I walked into. Staying honest when you have every reason to play dirty is not weakness. It's the rarest kind of strength there is. But being good wasn't enough on its own, and I won't pretend it was. I had to use my head. I read every statement. I learned how that family's money actually moved. I figured out that Trevor was a prince in a castle he didn't own, and I wrote a letter to the one person who held the real power instead of begging the one who didn't. Knowing where the leverage truly sits and having the patience to act on it slowly, that's a skill, and it's a skill any woman can build. You sharpen your mind the same way you build a muscle, by using it on the boring problems nobody else wants to touch. And then there was the part nobody sees. The 3 years of getting up every day, doing the books by lamplight after Eleanor fell asleep, paying my parents back in secret, refusing to break even when breaking would have felt like relief. That quiet, stubborn refusal to fall apart is what carried me from a pull-out bed in my mother's house to a seat my husband thought was his birthright. Endurance isn't dramatic. It's just showing up one more time than the situation expects you to. So if you take anything from what happened to me, take this. Be the person who tells the truth. Sharpen the mind that everyone underestimates, and outlast the ones who counted you out. Trevor had money and time and freedom, and he lost everything to a woman with a chipped mug and a baby on her hip, because in the end, character beats inheritance every single time.